Hi, and welcome. I'm Dr. Mark Peters, and I'm here today from Technica Corporation with Flying to DevSecOps with a U.S. Air Force cyber weapon system in our first year of operations. I'm the lead IA security engineer for that corporation. You can find me on Twitter at TinyCyber. I'm excited to be here at the RSAC conference. And now I'm starting this out, and as we said, we're flying to DevSecOps. So in flying to DevSecOps, what we're talking about is we're breaking up the same way we look at a mission as a pilot or a mission as a member of the Air Force. And that way is that the Air Force specializes in air power. And that culture that you start dealing with specializes in delivering that air power at the right place at the right time. This overall culture that they have from the Air Force, this overall influence goes on to even influence the way they do other things. And the reason for that is because the flying culture, and I used to work for the Air Force and I worked with a lot of flying squadrons, is that these rules they have were rules written in blood. And that meant that a rule was in place because somebody had died to enforce it. Something had happened tragically on the flying side of the world, and these standards had emerged to develop a pattern that went through. So things come down to test, test, and test again to prevent any error. And it is better to over-test and make sure that something is safe than to deliver something that is not safe. Well, that presents a challenge. That presents a real challenge when you talk about DevSecOps and you talk about trying to integrate security into that overall mindset and find a way to deal with the cultural challenge of making sure that it's safe and those rules written in blood and that waterfall mentality of overdone versus getting things out to the customer sooner and accelerating value. So when we start off, our contract took over, and we took over about a year ago. We took over in November of 2019. So just before the pandemic, before all those things were going on, we took over for a contract as the Defensive Applications and Network Support. Now, what this was a contract to support, maintain, and operate a defensive weapons system, a weapon system known as CVAH, or Cyber Vulnerability Analysis and Hunt. This was an off-net SOC, one that would come in with a secondary look at those functions that were actually going on in a network that the network teams on the Air Force bases weren't capable, weren't prepared to do, or a new set of tools that they could even use to expand. Now, what you had initially when we took over, what you had that they were looking at the government waterfall programs, right? So you see the simplified DoD acquisition strategy there on the slide that shows you a short way of getting from place to place. And you can see the overemphasis on admin and packaging versus the functional delivery that we really like to talk about in Agile. The previous one had done sustainment and maintenance and operations, but they were all under 3 separate contracts. So we were moving those together, and we were moving to DevSecOps at the same time, trying to figure out how we could make this transformation. Some of those immediate constraints we had is we had a constraint that we were going to use the scaled Agile framework. That was one the Air Force wanted to use, and that was the one that was developed for us. And then we wanted to have teams for our dev teams, our ops teams, our security teams, our integration lab teams, in other teams initially, and figure out how we needed to put these teams together to best integrate, to best move forward. So after we've walked around the plane, we've kind of checked out what's there. We have to check the weather because the things that are coming in that we don't know about, or the things that aren't really a part of what that process is. Well, one of the processes, we didn't have any standard infrastructure. None of those 3 previous contracts had left anything that we could really use or build from. So we're going to have to build that on our own. And that included the dev environment. How do we build that selection of workplaces and of pipelines to bring the code together and bring the code to check in a way that we could integrate as best as possible? We didn't start out with any physical workspaces. We didn't start out with any integrated security. The security team piece was all new, moving from compliance-based to a security-based. A lot of the software wasn't finished. They left it and they dumped it off when they moved from one contract to another, just like it happens. They were in the middle of that waterfall cycle, and when they hit the end of that, they just moved forward. The documentation for that software, because the software wasn't complete, they were waiting to do the documentation at the end and wasn't done either. And then, of course, like you always see with DevOps, as soon as we move to DevOps, the customer says, you've moved to DevOps, you've moved to Agile, that says you should deliver every 2 weeks. At the best and at the worst, you should be delivering every month because it's Agile and you have to deliver. So all of our timelines got accelerated along the way. So we've checked the weather, we've walked around the plane, now we're looking at the flight plan. Get ready for the takeoff. The first step we had to do is we had to set out those visions, those things that we wanted to do, that we thought we needed to do in that first year to move us forward. We needed to close software and documentation loopholes. As some say, we need to close some of that tech debt, some of the things that were half done and half baked that were going forward. We had an architecture, but we had a very high level architecture, as you can see. That interceptor platform that uses a deployable interceptor kit that has systems and sensors, that uses a interface for the user, and then uses an in-garrison system. And all these had different places and different tools and different interactions that had to get together. We had to find out how to get not just the documentation together, but the software together so that we could document it appropriately. We had to find a way to innovate those things to successful delivery, to take the programs that we had, to take the programs that we put into place, and find a way to link them together. And of course, if we're doing DevOps, we have to come up with a winning culture. If we don't have a winning culture, then we don't have anything that lasts. We don't have anything to move us forward. So as we started our flight, the first thing that hit us, the first thing was the clouds ahead. We anticipated moving into a new building right away. And this may not seem like a security issue, but it is from the sense of having the network and having the place where all your tools are accessible to you. You have a way that you can communicate with other folks. And because of the place we moved into, the lease and the landlord and the furniture wasn't immediately available right away. So that's an immediate stop. We went through 3 temporary sites along the way before finishing in that nicely depicted building you see over on the right. And then, of course, we had to be able to move from a dev-controlled environment to a continuous infrastructure. What we had before was that when the devs needed an environment, they spun up their own environment. They spun up their own infrastructure. And there wasn't any central security architecture that was linking those things together. They didn't even know what the architecture was. All they knew was that they were spinning up the environment for their own pieces and making it forward. So we needed to find a way to blend those pieces together, to get infrastructure as code, to get common infrastructure as code, so that we were delivering the same virtual environment, so that we could get to this off-net weapon system and deliver the same physical environment as well. So the lessons from those clouds, you had to be able to match requirement from need. The main reason to go back and forth between 2 different physical sites or 3 different physical sites was we weren't sure what the requirements were as we were growing quickly in those first couple of days. We knew that we needed a couple teams. We weren't sure how many people we needed on the teams or even the common areas where those teams would interact. We had a tool, we used DI2E to match up, but we weren't sure of how to get those pieces together in the physical environment to match the virtual environment. So we did our team building across multiple sites. And we managed to do that through linking with the networking, with the connections, with the Zoom and the Teams and the other functions that went through. And we made sure that our virtual presence, although not equal to virtual presence, connected everyone on the team. And that we managed to share the security and managed to share the integrations as we went forward into that final location, into that final spot where we could put our lab and we could put our instance. So in putting the lab together, we have to test the switches, right? We have to make sure that everything works as we're flying. We have to make sure that we keep it together. We already mentioned that we had a varied baseline. We didn't have things together, and because they were done differently, each piece was submitted as it was done instead of submitted as part of the whole. So it went out and you were never quite sure what the backwards integration was, which meant that you had a real gap in the security of that existing platform because the pieces didn't fit together smoothly and they didn't integrate smoothly. So we had to make sure that as we did that, we got to operational test, to integrated test. And we developed a test method or a test set of branches for all these different languages we were using in all these different programs that we could automate through those functions, that we could do the unit testing and the static code analysis. And we moved up through the branches. We did more and more testing. And those test reports come back. And as those test reports come back, each set of individuals got to look at those tests and they matched those tests that were coming forward to the known baseline, to the known good, so that we know what was out there. And we kept those things that were out there. And then as we did those, as the developers wrote code, we said, hey, not only should you write the code, but you should develop the documentation. You should draft the initial sets of documentation that are out there. And you need to find a way to communicate what it is you're doing and how it is you're doing it so that we get it together. That each team has a responsibility for the documentation to the broader team. So what did we find? If the switches were failing, we found a way around those switches. And we found that having some tech writers in place helped greatly. Having someone with some experience got the documentation together and got the documentation together effectively. And as a security team, we worked with those tech writers to make sure that we understood what the documentation was. So not only was the documentation good for the code and good for the execution, but the documentation we had was being used by our security to support our audit and to support our functions that came later and to support, since it was an Air Force document, our authority to operate. At the same time as we were doing that and straightening out the documentation, we were also refactoring the code base. We were doing things that were not immediately feature deliverable, but we're working the code together. We're pulling the different pieces together so that we can make those connections in the future, and that each step got more and more secure as it went forward. As an example, some of the audit functions on the earlier versions of the program were turned off. They were disabled entirely, and they weren't even included in the delivery. So we got to functions like win log beats, then putting those functions in and making sure that they automatically turned on with the install, that the Ansible and the other functions were kicking them off, and then producing the logs that went back so that we could check on those things on a regular basis, and so that we had a way to communicate between the different functions. We also found a way to coordinate the resources among the different development teams. With that virtual lab that we had standing up, they stood up a different instance for dev, and they stood up an instance for code, and they stood up an instance for our tech writers, that the tech writers could even kick off and run a set of the program and test to make sure that the documentation they had and that they had helped with was still completely appropriate as we move forward. And that every team that was kicking off had the same infrastructure. They had that same infrastructure to kick off for all three sections of the CVH program. And they ran it, and they ran it, and they ran it virtually, and they ran it virtually for all three systems, and then they could run it on the actual hardware of all three systems without ever leaving the lab. And they could schedule that through a calendar that we had across our small team. And I keep saying small team, and we had less than 100. We probably had less than 50 for the first 6 to 9 months of people going forward between all the dev teams and all the administration, everybody else moving that system forward. So as we move forward from those initial implementations, we talk about compliance. We talk about where's the chart, where's the map. Well, we all know the federal government has heavy compliance, and that they need a lot of that paperwork done. As a matter of fact, the system that we inherited on their previous authority to operate had over 900 open plans of actions and milestones that they needed solved to move forward. They needed all of those things actioned on, they needed all those things with a response, and they need all those things tied tightly together. And they all required paperwork because it's the government, the federal government. Not only would they like the paperwork, but they like it to be continuous. They'd like it to be every time that you go out there and you submit it, it remains the same, that you be able to fold those things together. And we had to find a way to fold on our own, a folding compliance and agile together. How do we keep our team agile as we move forward? And we're looking at things like the regulations that we had to meet, the different Air Force standards for what they needed for security and what they were responsible for. And not just the security and the development, but the operational security of the program, of knowing that one of the Air Force teams comes out and finds a common vulnerability, and they bring that vulnerability back and says, go through and check and make sure where it is. And the NIST standards, the 853, the governance at the same time with the transparency, and making sure we were doing all the right things to move forward and keep ourselves together with those things. And did we learn lessons about folding the maps? I think we learned some really good lessons about folding the maps, especially from a security standpoint. We found out we really needed to integrate the security into the teams. Our security in the past had been compliance-based. And you had found somebody who was good at code 10 or 15 years ago, and you had taken them and moved them into the compliance section to working the security paperwork for the government, and left them out of the piece where they needed to fall back and really understand the code from that DevSecOps standpoint. So we rolled that back the other way. We made sure that we started our team on a Kanban board, using a system of flowing from one to the other, and keeping our security policy and our security integrations in a common place where there was transparency for everyone to see, that there was transparency for all the developers to go through and see exactly what it was we were working on. And not only did we do that, but we made sure, even for our small team, we had one security individual for each of the teams that we had out there. So we assigned one of those folks to each of the teams. And we made sure that we went out there to the teams and we were present in their daily stand-ups, and we were present in their daily meetings on a day-to-day basis. And we talked to them about security. We talked to them about the STIGs, the secure technical implementation guidance, and what we needed and why we needed and what the application was, and how we integrated those pieces to go together. And so in order to do that, we also had to establish continuous monitoring. And we continuously monitored what was going on by being present. And by being present not just in their teams, but on their boards. And on their boards, the functions that went forward so that we could develop security and that we could get to a good answer. And in the end, you know what? We closed over 900 of those poems. We had 47 left when we submitted out of the over 1,000 we started with. We were approved for an ATO for 2 years. So that brings us to how did it really work? If we did these things and we made these lessons forward, what does it really look like? Well, in order to have the comparison, because we talked about having the baseline for a risk comparison and for a security comparison as you move forward, you have to have the baseline for what had happened before. So the CVAH system, is a quick bit of history, was initially released in 2013, and it was designated as a weapon system, which sounds like a very neat thing. But in the Air Force, what the weapon system means is it draws a line around that budget system. Everything that goes with it falls under that central budget designation, whether it's training, whether it's sustainment, whatever it is, it falls under that. So we all fall under the same line, and we all are able to manage a common baseline. So it was released, and they did a quick version update as soon as they released it, quick 2.5 years later, from April 2013 to October 2015. In December of 2016, they released a version 2.0, which came after the January, I'm sorry, I went too far forward. In January of 2016, it was transitioned to the PMO, or the Program Management Office, someone at the government in a life cycle management center who would own it and own the program going together. And then in December of 2016, they managed to release version 2.0. Then 15 months later, they came up with version 3.0. And after that, there was nothing. We took over, as I said, in November of 2019. They said that 3.1.2 was released, but there were competing customizations. They didn't release just one version, they released multiple versions. And if you've ever worked with configuring against multiple versions, you know how difficult that is to baseline, and you know the challenges and the headaches that can pose from a security perspective. So when we took over in 2019, we released the first 3.2.1 release in 2020. And then in January of 2020. Then in June, we did version 3.3. In October, we did 3.4. And in January, we did 3.5. We just got that one out the door. So we're on track to release every couple months, every 3 months, which is once a quarter, which doesn't seem a lot from a DevOps perspective. If you go back to Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren, you hear mature teams release several times a day. But on the government side, to release and to maintain compliance 4 times a year is pretty good. So what do we do? What do we find some of these things? As we circle the field and look at what we did, what were the things we inherited that really stand out? Well, there was some cultural debt. There was some process of inheriting the waterfall and inheriting the previous contract. And you can't complain about it too much because every team has to self-organize and has to be able to build their own type of structure. So those changing leadership structures were advocated. We talked about it a lot. We did a lot of the self-organizing. We did a lot of the supporting the teams as we went forward to figure out exactly what the best leadership structure was. And we had individuals that were in each of the sections. We had a lead from a dance side. We tried to mirror the program side. We had a lead engineer. We had a lead in charge of the lab and the integration lab. We had an architect. We had myself as a security individual. We had a program manager. And we had a logistics individual who made sure that all the pieces got where they were supposed to since we were shipping hardware. And we made sure that we got together a couple times a week to sit down and talk about the functions, to manage the functions all the way through. We had our dev teams. We had our 4 development teams doing development, working the functions, or 3 to start with an engineering and architecture team. Each of those running 10 to 15 individuals. We had our security team, which was our 4 individuals. Then we had our ops teams that were actually at the site that did tier 1, tier 2 maintenance, and then sent the tier 3 maintenance back to the development center. So we had each of those functions moving forward. And one of the cultural debt things that we struggled with a little bit was who runs whom, which portion of which section went forward, in which portion of which section was most important for driving it. We found that it was different on a day-to-day basis. You couldn't set something and say the program manager gets to set the guidance or the engineer gets to set the guidance because a lot of it varied based on what we were answering. on what the practices were and what the products were as we move forward. And we moved from just the cultural debt to the process debt. Right? What were the processes we inherited? Well, we already mentioned about the customer timelines. The customer wanted it to go faster, and they needed it to go faster, and we wound up delivering on it going faster. But that didn't mean that their processes still weren't tied tightly to that waterfall. A lot of those processes are still tied to that DoD acquisition framework. Despite the fact that you see them, you have to work to make things faster. As an example, one of the requirements for the ATO is it asks for risk assessment guidance. It asks for a separate document in an Excel spreadsheet that goes through and defines each level of risk, each separate level of risk, all the way through. Well, this is after you've submitted a 1,200-page document that explains for each NIST control where you're at, what the policy is that applies to it, and what the next policy is. So we went back to our headquarters and we said, hey, we don't really need to do the risk assessment because we've done 1,200 pages of risk assessment. So to redo it and recompile it in this manner is really a process issue. And they agreed with us, and they let us keep where we had and move ahead without dealing with that process issue. And we had to organize the teams because we couldn't just organize the teams the way that they were before. And we couldn't organize the teams the way the government was used to, even though they had the most experience, because it hadn't worked before. And to keep doing something that hasn't succeeded, I've heard several times it's a definition of insanity, to keep doing something the same way and expect a different result. So we organized our teams differently. We built our teams differently. And we made sure that we scattered some of those people who transitioned from the previous contract so that they could get the broader experience of what was going on and the broader functionality of how we move forward. We did have some technical debt as well. As we mentioned, there were things that were in previous code or previous instances. One of the first and the biggest instances we found as we moved forward was we moved from Jenkins to GitLab. Jenkins was nice, but it wasn't doing everything we needed from a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. So we went to one of those basic versions of GitLab that we had out there, and we deployed it forward. Now, I have to tell you, as a security guy, when we went to GitLab, I went back to my guys a couple of weeks later, and I said, hey, we found a GitLab. That's great. They have all these great new security dashboards, and I'm really excited about getting to use the security dashboards and tracking those metrics and figuring out how we can get those tools in place. I said, well, we didn't buy that version. We didn't turn that on. So there's communication between the teams. But we found a way around it. The way we found around it was we found a way to actually get into the logs from the runners and be able to look at the security and get our individuals on the teams familiar with what we had as a baseline scan versus the scans and the logs that were playing in that runner so that they could compare the two, so that they had a visibility of what was going on. We used those dashboards to create transparency. The fact that anyone could get into the GitLab, the fact that anyone could get into the ACAS scanner from Tenable that we were using to run our security scans and look at the raw scan as well as the other scan created that transparency across the board. And not just the raw scan, but we also posted those scans on a regular basis. And we took those scans that we had, those security items, and we brought them back to the teams and said, hey, this is what we have. This is what we're working with. And that holds true for both the static and the dynamic scans. With the static and looking at the code and looking at the best code, we were using SonarQube. And a lot of those metrics were getting reported out at the team level on a daily basis as they were putting things forward, as they were doing their commits. We were talking about what their code was and what their successes were so that we could move forward and ensure security for everyone. So what do we do if we're down on the ground and our flight's complete, we're moving forward as we look back? We had 4 releases in 12 months. Now that's exceptional from a government standpoint. The government says they want to have, like I said, that waterfall, and a 3 to 5 year is good. Heck, even the rapid acquisition program for the government, when they assign someone to figure out a new, faster way of doing things, the team to design the rapid program took 3 years of looking at it before they released their initial report of how long it was going to take to institute a rapid program to move things faster. So to be able to get 4 releases out to the customer with new features, bringing in some of the Kubernetes-based systems, bringing in more options, moving from Windows 2012 to 2019 on the server base, getting rid of some of those inherent vulnerabilities, that was great for our team. Then, as I mentioned, we got compliant with the standards. At NIST 853, we went through all those controls. And what's even better, because our security teams were integrated with the day-to-day, when it came time to writing the ATO, we know where the evidence was. And even though we had to move it from system to system, instead of dragging somebody else down to ask for something and not getting the right product and going back and asking again and not getting the right product, we knew where it was ourselves. When it came time to clip how we were doing something, when it came time to talk about two-factor authentication and where the two-factor was and how it was installed and how it was used and where the configuration was and where that WinLog beats file went, we had that all as the security team because we had dug into the code and dug into the GitLab to make sure that we had the right features. We moved to a new building. That seems small, but it changes everything. And it changed access to the server room because, as I mentioned, not only did we have access to software in the virtual environment, but we needed to be able to construct a physical environment. And this gave access to physical equipment that the teams could go in and test on and use when they needed to. And then we went from the 3 dev teams and the engineering and architecture team to a 4th dev team. Because the rate of features we were delivering, the customer said, we want to keep this up. And in order to keep it up, we think we need a 4th team. We need more features delivered in that rate and faster. So where does that get us? Where do we go from there? Once we shut down the engine, what are kind of those lessons learned that we have? Well, we like continuous monitoring, but we need more continuous monitoring. We need that monitoring to get to more of the continuous ATO. As an off-net function, we don't link everything together today. So while everyone is going cloud-based, ours is going to more off-cloud and more centric. But we're looking to alleviate that. And we're looking to alleviate that through some hybrid cloud enactments. From using some controlled functions to go through, to using some controlled standards to build across and make the functions so that we can get to a continuous ATO. And a continuous ATO means that we always have the authority to operate, that we always have the authority to go forward and be checked by delivering our continuous monitoring solution into a pre-prepared repo. We'd like to use some AI, some ML agents to improve our pipelines, to set those metrics in place and have the observation of those metrics and the integration of those metrics to both speed and accelerate our ability to release on demand. Of course, release on demand ties back to our cloud solutions, that we need to go to some type of cloud solution to be able to move that forward. And we've been working on that, integrating that, so we get those pieces tied together and that we can have a secure cloud solution as we move forward. What were the ultimate lessons here? You have to practice. We had to practice every day. You have to do it over and over and over. Malcolm Gladwell talks about perfect practice. It's not practice that makes perfect. It's perfect practice that makes perfect. And to get familiarity with something, you have to do it 500 times. And to become proficient, you have to do it 5,000 times. And we found the same thing. You have to practice over and over again. And you have to practice whether it's the integration or the local teams or the local factors that drive you to that function. And the best way to get there, even when you're practicing, is transparency. Being able to look at what the other teams are doing, being able to see everything and have it all out there. Now, that open kimono approach is kind of frowned upon a lot of times, especially in government, because they don't want to show everyone else what's going on. They don't want everyone to know what their process is or know how they're moving it forward. But that transparency drives success. And it happens through setting clear goals. And the clear goals that we set as we move forward, as we learn from those initial goals, is to accelerate the value of delivery, is to accelerate the way forward, to try to drive a quarterly release for on-prem solution, have a rapid maintenance response. We have those teams on site and we deliver those teams to move forward, to help out with what's there at the tier 1 and tier 2, and then move the tier 3 back to the developer level. To secure test and integration, like we did on that earlier slide, where you have the test and you have the integration at every step of the development chain. At every step of that pipeline, you're testing back and testing back and testing back. And then, of course, continuous compliance, because it is a security talk. And where would we be without compliance? So we get to those functions and we set those clear goals. And I really have to emphasize that we set them again in order to move forward. And finally, as we apply them, what can you do with this? How can you take this away? In the next week, if you're thinking about a DevSecOps transition, you should analyze what you intend to accomplish. You should think about what those goals are, and you should lay them out clearly. As for the next 90 days, as you move forward, examine each iteration. As you move to sprints, Think carefully about each retrospective and review. Make sure that you have actionable reviews and that you're using those to move forward on your technical debt, on your cultural debt, on your process debt, maybe even on people debt, because we talk about culture, process, and people. And we talk about how those people interact with those functions. And then the next 6 months, if you're still having success, adjust to your new statuses. Make changes to achieve your goals. You have to know that as you move forward, it's small steps. And even though it doesn't seem like those small steps are doing a lot, when you make those small steps, 6 months from now, you'll look back and you won't recognize where we started. We never would have thought over a year ago that we would have an integrated, ATO compliant, and have delivered 4 times and have this multiple lab set within a year. And yet we did, and the security worked. Thank you very much. I enjoyed giving this talk. I enjoyed the chance to be here at the RSA Conference 2021, talking about resilience and talking about experiences. Have a great day.